On a hillside about 30 kilometers outside Baku, a strip of ground has been on fire continuously for at least the last several thousand years. It's not a volcano, and nobody lit it. Natural gas seeps up through the rock and ignites on contact with air. And it's been doing that for so long that Zoroastrian fire worshippers built shrines around it 2,500 years ago. Azerbaijan's own name is sometimes translated as Land of Fire. What's really changed since those Zoroastrian priests is the scale. This country now sits on so much oil and gas that at the turn of the 20th century, it was producing more than half the entire world's petroleum supply. Same fire, much bigger flame. Welcome to episode 11 of Around the World in Half an Hour. I'm Ray. Azerbaijan sits in the South Caucasus on the western shore of the Caspian, and it's a country whose story runs through nearly every major 20th century upheaval without ever quite getting the attention that history usually earns. An oil boom that helped power the Russian Empire, the first secular democratic republic in the Muslim world, a brutal end to Soviet rule, and a long, difficult, still not entirely finished conflict with its western neighbor. We covered part of that conflict from Armenia's side a few episodes back. Today, we're covering the rest of it, along with chess champions, mud volcanoes, and a very literal land of fire. Let's get into it. Azerbaijan covers about 86,600 square kilometers, roughly the size of Austria, wedged into the South Caucasus between the Greater Caucasus Range in the north and the Lesser Caucasus in the southwest, with the Caspian Sea, the largest inland body of water on Earth, forming its entire eastern edge. Despite the mountains on both flanks, most of the country is actually lowland. The Kura Araz lowland, running through the center, sits partly below sea level, and the capital Baku, sitting on the Absheron Peninsula that juts into the Caspian, is the lowest lying national capital anywhere in the world, around 28 meters below sea level. The highest point, Bazar Duzu, reaches 4,466 meters up in the Greater Caucasus on the border with Russia's Dagestan region. The country's geology does some strange things at ground level. Azerbaijan holds somewhere between 3 and 400 mud volcanoes, more than almost anywhere else on the planet. Cone-shaped formations that periodically ooze or occasionally erupt cold, gassy mud rather than lava, a phenomenon tied to the same underground oil and gas deposits that have shaped the country's entire economic history. Combine that with the Yanardagh fire mountain from our cold open, and you got a landscape that's been quietly advertising what's underneath it for millennia, long before anyone had the technology to drill for it. Azerbaijan borders Russia to the north, Georgia to the northwest, Armenia to the west, and Iran to the south, plus a short stretch of border with Turkey, not through Azerbaijan's main territory, but through Nakhchivan, an Azerbaijani exclave separated from the rest of the country by a strip of Armenian territory, and bordered by Armenia, Iran, and Turkey. That exclave situation is a direct legacy of Soviet-era border drawing, and it's central to the peace negotiations still ongoing with Armenia today, since Azerbaijan has pushed for a transit corridor through southern Armenia to connect Nakhchivan more directly to the rest of the country. This is a strategic location, the meeting point of the Caucasus, the edge of Central Asia, and a direct land bridge between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And it's shaped Azerbaijan's history the same way similar crossroads geography has shaped plenty of other small, frequently fought over nations we've covered on this show. Human settlement in Azerbaijan goes back a very long way. The Gobustan rock art site south of Baku contains over 6,000 petroglyphs dating from roughly 5,000 to 40,000 years ago, among the oldest recorded evidence of human habitation anywhere in the Caucasus. Ancient Caucasian Albania, a kingdom distinct from and unrelated to the Balkan Albania, controlled much of the region from around the 4th century BC, and Zoroastrianism took deep root here, drawn by exactly the kind of natural fire phenomena we opened with. Before the region passed through Persian, Arab, Turkic, and Mongol control across the medieval centuries and eventually became contested ground between the Persian and Ottoman empires and later Russia. By the early 19th century, Russia had absorbed the northern Azerbaijani Khanates through treaties with Persia, splitting historically Azerbaijani territory roughly along the line that still separates the modern republic from Iranian Azerbaijan to the south. Baku's oil wasn't a secret. It had been extracted in small quantities for centuries. But industrial scale drilling took off in the 1870s. And by 1901, Baku alone was producing over half the world's total oil output, drawing in the Nobel and Rothschild families as major investors and turning the city into a fully cosmopolitan boomtown of Azerbaijanis, Russians, Armenians, Jews, and European engineers and entrepreneurs, all packed into the same fast growing capital. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, a coalition of Azerbaijani political leaders declared the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic on May 28, 1918, the first secular parliamentary democracy anywhere in the Muslim world, built on universal suffrage that included women, a full 2 years before the United States and well ahead of most of Western Europe. In its brief 23 months, the Republic opened Baku State University, ended press censorship, and ran an active foreign policy while fending off territorial disputes with Armenia and holding together through serious internal division. It didn't survive contact with the Red Army. The Soviet 11th Army invaded on April 28, 1920, and the Republic fell within days. Though resistance to full Soviet consolidation continued for some time afterward at real human cost. Azerbaijan spent the next 70 years as a Soviet republic, its oil fields feeding Soviet industry so heavily that Lenin himself reportedly said the Soviet state couldn't survive without Baku's oil. The final years of Soviet rule brought events that remain deeply, separately significant to two different neighboring countries' national memories. And it's worth being precise about both rather than collapsing them into one story. In February 1988, as the movement for Nagorno-Karabakh's transfer to Armenian control gathered pace, organized mobs in the city of Sumgait, just outside Baku, attacked the local Armenian population over 3 days. Official Soviet figures recorded 32 deaths, while Armenian sources and later investigations suggest the real toll was considerably higher, likely in the hundreds, when related incidents are included. Similar violence recurred in Kirovabad later that year. Then, in 1990 January, further large-scale violence targeted Baku's own substantial Armenian community, killing at least several dozen people over roughly a week. While Interior Ministry troops stationed in the city largely failed to intervene, while Interior Ministry troops stationed in the city largely failed to intervene, Soviet leadership responded by declaring a state of emergency and sending in the army. But the resulting crackdown on the night of January 19th and 20th, 1990, killed somewhere between 131 and around 170 people. The overwhelming majority, ordinary Azerbaijani civilians and independence demonstrators rather than the Armenian population the intervention was officially meant to protect. Human Rights Watch's own assessment at the time described the Soviet military response as so disproportionate to any actual resistance that it amounted to collective punishment. Azerbaijanis call this Black January, and it's commemorated as a national day of mourning every year. The event that more than any other hardened Azerbaijani resolve for full independence, which followed in October 1991. Between the pogroms and the broader conflict that followed, Azerbaijan's once substantial ethnic Armenian population, several hundred thousand people under Soviet rule, left almost entirely within a few years. Independence brought immediate war with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, a conflict Azerbaijan lost decisively by 1994, ceding not just the region itself but a ring of surrounding territory to Armenian control for the following 3 decades. Haidar Aliyev, a former KGB general and Soviet-era Politburo member who'd led Soviet Azerbaijan from 1969 to 1982, returned to power amid the chaos in 1993 and ruled until his death in 2003, when his own son, Ilham Aliyev, succeeded him, a transition of power that's remained within the same family ever since. Under Ilham Aliyev, Azerbaijan rebuilt its military with oil funded weapons purchases and, in a 6 week war in autumn 2020, retook most of the territory lost in the 1990s, backed by Turkish drone technology and support. In September 2023, a rapid follow up offensive completed the reversal, and Nagorno Karabakh's ethnic Armenian population, well over 100,000 people, left for Armenia within days, as we covered from the Armenian side of this story back in episode 8. Azerbaijan describes this as the legitimate reintegration of internationally recognized Azerbaijani territory. International human rights organizations and many independent observers have described the manner of the population's departure following months of blockade as ethnic cleansing. Both descriptions sit in the historical record. This podcast isn't going to adjudicate between them. Azerbaijan's population sits at roughly 10.3 million, with close to a quarter of that concentrated in Greater Baku. Ilham Aliyev remains president, and Azerbaijan's political system is widely characterized by international monitors as authoritarian. Reporters Without Borders ranked the country 171st out of 180 nations in its 2026 Press Freedom Index, describing virtually the entire domestic media sector as under state control. And Human Rights Watch's 2026 report documented continued prosecution of journalists and civil society figures, alongside the suspension or expulsion of several UN affiliated humanitarian organizations. The Aliyev family has also featured prominently in international financial disclosures, including the Panama Papers, connecting relatives to offshore holdings and domestic business interests. Azerbaijan's own government frames its approach differently, emphasizing stability, territorial security, and rapid economic development following decades of conflict. On the diplomatic front, Azerbaijan and Armenia initiated the text of a peace treaty in 2025, formalized in a joint declaration signed at the White House in August of that year with US mediation. As of mid 2026, that treaty has not been formally signed by both governments or ratified by either parliament. Aliyev has stated that a final signature depends on Armenia first removing territorial claims to Azerbaijan from its own constitution, a change that remains politically difficult inside Armenia. In the meantime, the border has stayed calm for roughly 2 years. Direct communications have resumed, and Baku hosted the United Nations COP29 climate conference in the late 2024, a significant marker of the international engagement Azerbaijan has pursued since the fighting ended. Garry Kasparov, still widely regarded as the greatest chess player in history, was born in Baku in 1963 to a Jewish father and an Armenian mother in a Soviet era city that he's since described as unusually cosmopolitan. Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Jews, and Russians living and marrying across ethnic lines in a way he's said that simply didn't happen in neighboring Yerevan or Tbilisi. Haidar Aliyev, then leading Soviet Azerbaijan, personally arranged resources and protection for the teenage Kasparov's chess career, later telling him plainly that his ethnicity didn't matter. What mattered was that he was from Baku. Kasparov left for Russia as an adult and has had no relationship with Azerbaijan's current government since. But when a chess tournament brought him back to the city in 2016, he asked friends to photograph his childhood home and his father's grave. The apartment where he was born is a clothing store now. He wasn't the only major figure to come out of that same Soviet era Baku. The cellist and conductor Mstislav Rostropovich, widely considered one of the finest cellists of the 20th century, was born there in 1927. And the physicist Lev Landau, who won the 1962 Nobel Prize for his work on condensed matter theory, was born in the city too. Haidar Aliyev himself belongs on this list on his own terms, whatever one makes of the dynasty he founded. A Soviet era KGB general and Politburo member who later steered independent Azerbaijan through its most difficult early years, and whose name now sits on the country's largest airport, its main cultural center, and a fair share of its public squares. And Natavan, born Khurshid Banu Natavan in 1832, was the last hereditary princess of the Karabakh Khanate and became one of the 19th century Azerbaijan's most significant poets, using her position to fund public infrastructure in Shusha while writing ghazals that are still studied today. Plov, saffron rice pilaf, layered and cooked with meat, dried fruit, or herbs, depending on the region, is Azerbaijan's closest thing to a national dish, with dozens of documented regional variations rather than one fixed recipe. Dolma, stuffed grape leaves or vegetables, shows up here too, as it does across much of the wider Caucasus and Middle East. And much like the Pavlova dispute we ran into in Australia, whose version came first, is a friendly, long running argument across several countries in the region rather than a settled question. Kebab, grilled over open coals and usually served with fresh herbs and flatbread rather than heavy sauce, is a daily staple. And black tea, served in small pear shaped glasses called armudu, functions as the default social gesture, offered constantly to guests and strangers alike, with sugar taken by holding a cube between the teeth rather than stirring it in. Pomegranate features heavily too, both fresh and reduced into nar sharab, a dark syrup used to finish grilled meat and fish. On our places to visit list, Baku comes first. Baku's old city, or Içerişehir, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site built around the 12th century Maiden Tower and the palace of the Shirvanshahs, walled fortifications that sit in striking, deliberate contrast to the ultra modern flame towers looming right behind them. and the Zaha Hadid designed Hyder Aliyev Center, whose flowing, seamless, white curves have made it one of the most photographed buildings in the former Soviet space. The seafront boulevard promenade connects much of this on foot, running for some 25 kilometers along the Caspian. Gobistan, about an hour south of the city, combines those 6,000 plus ancient petroglyphs with an active field of mud volcanoes right nearby. An odd pairing of deep human history and ongoing, faintly absurd geology within the same short visit. Sheki, out in the western Caucasus foothills, centers on an 18th century Khan's palace decorated with shebeke, intricate stained glass latticework assembled entirely without nails or glue, and the town's old caravanserais, once stops on Silk Road trade routes, now function as hotels. Azerbaijan uses the manat, and the economy remains heavily built on oil and natural gas, which together still account for the large majority of export revenue despite years of government rhetoric about diversification into agriculture, logistics, and tourism. The World Bank classifies Azerbaijan as an upper middle income economy with a high human development ranking, and Baku in particular has seen enormous state driven investment in modern infrastructure over the past 2 decades, funded substantially by hydrocarbon revenue. Outside the capital, and especially in regions still recovering from the recent conflict, that wealth is considerably less evenly distributed, and the government's post 2023 reconstruction plans for the recovered Karabakh territories represent a major ongoing state spending priority. Internationally, Azerbaijan is known, when it's known at all, for oil, for Baku's dramatic modern skyline, and increasingly for the Formula One street race that's run through the city's downtown every year since 2016. A race whose starting grid sits somewhat pointedly right on Freedom Square, the site of some of the country's largest ever political protests. Regionally, Azerbaijan is known for the same Karabakh conflict that dominates how Armenia is perceived too, just from the opposite side of the story. What gets far less global attention, the sheer scale of Baku's turn of the century oil boom, which briefly made the city one of the most important industrial centers on earth, and a chess tradition serious enough to have shaped one of the greatest players the game has ever produced. Mugham, a form of melodic, largely improvised modal music built around traditional instruments like the tar, kamancha, and balaban, forms the emotional core of Azerbaijani musical identity and is recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of humanity's oral heritage. Ashiks, traveling poet musicians who compose and perform their own material live, carry a closely related tradition that stretches back centuries. Carpet weaving, passed down within families for generations, is UNESCO listed too, with distinct regional patterns from Baku, Khuba, Sheki, and Karabakh, each carrying their own recognizable design language. Architecturally, Baku is unusually willing to let centuries sit directly next to each other without smoothing the transition. The walled medieval old city backs almost directly onto some of the most aggressively contemporary architecture in the former Soviet world, funded by the same oil wealth that built the mansions of the original 1900s boom era. Azerbaijan has also been an enthusiastic Eurovision participant since 2008, winning the contest outright in 2011 and hosting it in Baku the following year, a level of soft power investment in the competition that few other countries have matched. Chess carries real cultural weight here, well beyond Kasparov's individual fame. Azerbaijan has produced multiple grandmasters and invests seriously in youth chess development, treating the game as a genuine point of national pride in the way we've now seen in a couple of other countries on this show. Football is the most widely followed sport day to day, and wrestling and combat sports have produced Olympic medalists, including Namir Abdullayev's wrestling medals at consecutive games in the early 2000s. And since 2016, Baku's Formula One city circuit has become the country's highest profile sporting export, an unusually fast wall-lined street track that regularly produces some of the more chaotic, crash-heavy races on the entire F1 calendar. Most people outside the region know Azerbaijan, if at all, as an oil-rich country somewhere in the general vicinity of Russia and Iran, with little sense of its specific history. Its brief but pioneering democratic republic, or its deep Soviet-era cosmopolitanism, largely dissolved now. What tends to surprise first-time visitors is how aggressively modern and internationally styled central Baku actually feels, closer in visual language to Dubai than anywhere else in the Caucasus. What Azerbaijan does well and gets comparatively little global credit for, an oil and gas funded infrastructure build out that's happened remarkably fast, and a cultural heritage, Mugham, carpet weaving, Gobustan's ancient rock art, with a depth that the country's petrostate reputation tends to overshadow entirely. What Azerbaijan is actively navigating right now, alongside its economic ambitions, is a human rights record that most independent international monitors rate as poor, sitting in open tension with a government eager for international recognition and investment in equal measure. Garry Kasparov, decades removed from the city and with no relationship left to its current government, still asked friends to photograph his childhood home and his father's grave. The one time he went back in 2016 for a chess tournament. The apartment where he was born is a clothing store now. That's true of a lot of this history. The multicultural Baku that produced a chess champion, a world class cellist, and a Nobel physicist within a few streets of each other in the same generation isn't really there to go back to anymore. Whatever else the city has become instead. Next time, alphabetically, the Bahamas. A genuinely different relationship with water than the one we just spent this whole episode standing next to. Thanks for listening to Around the World in Half an Hour. If you've enjoyed this one, follow the show and leave a review. It helps people find us. Until next Monday.